You know, perhaps we shouldn't be so surprised. After all, this is a government whose defence equipment minister, pt3, unequivocally stated back in June, and I quote, he said this: "There will be a very, very, very heavy ministerial commitment to arms sales. There is a sense that in the past we were rather embarrassed about exporting defence products. There is no such embarrassment in this government." Well, no, clearly not. But as we Greens know, there certainly should be. And that's why it's been long-standing Green Party policy to call for an immediate and properly enforced ban on selling arms to those who torture, who lock up political opponents, and use violence against peaceful protesters. And that's why a UN asset freeze and total arms embargo should be just the first step, along with a commitment to investigate and punish all crimes under international law, with referral to the International Criminal Court as necessary. And here at home, of course, in a very different context, we've seen the courage of communities up and down the country as they try to fight the government's savage cuts. Not only savage because of their scale, but also their apparent satisfaction with which the coalition is imposing them. Voluntary groups starved of support, dedicated public service workers sacked, vital services closed. But people are mobilizing to resist these cuts. Individuals, local communities, charities, unions, all working to point out the folly of what's being done to our economy and to our society. Groups coming together not only to save their own library, their own wood, their own hospital from the threat of privatisation or closure, but coming together to protect all the libraries, all the woods, and all the hospitals. And it's our role to give voice to this movement in the political sphere. Our role because the traditional parties have shown themselves fundamentally out of tune with the people they claim to represent. Take the Liberal Democrats. Only a short year ago, they claimed to represent those millions who knew that education is a public benefit and should not be given only to those who are able to shoulder enormous debts. They pledged not to increase tuition fees, and yet a few short months later, and such pledges are in tatters. And now the Lib Dems are being punished, and rightly so. And Nick Clegg and his colleagues have one ray of hope that they're clinging on to as they slide below 10% in the polls. And they are hoping that they'll be proved right on the cuts, that the economy will miraculously turn around, people will feel good and forget, and that they'll be re-elected in 4 years' time, all sins forgiven. Well, they couldn't be more wrong. They still can't understand why their voters deserted them. Because it's not just because of the state of the economy. It's not even because of the question of how best to fund higher education in the UK. It's about trust. Millions of people trusted the Liberal Democrats. They voted for them in the belief that they stood for decency, for public services, and for constitutional reform. And the Lib Dems have betrayed that trust all down the line. And that's why the voters have deserted them, and that's why it doesn't matter what happens to the economy. The Lib Dems will never be trusted in that way again, and nor do they deserve to be. And what of Labour? On health, education, climate change and welfare, Labour candidates were happy to sign up to all kinds of positive statements during the election campaign, even when their party had done nothing in these areas during the 13 years that they've been in power, and when the Labour Party manifesto was saying something completely different. So what kind of opposition to this Tory-led government can they offer now? Well, the truth is that Labour is fatally compromised by having introduced many of the very policies that the coalition is now pursuing to their logical conclusion. The trebling of tuition fees will leave students with an enormous debt burden. But who first introduced tuition fees? Labour. Selling off the Royal Mail is likely to lead to the closure of hundreds more of our local post offices. Who first introduced that? Labour. The government's health reforms are likely to lead to the privatisation of the NHS. But who first introduced the market into the health service? Labour. Now, to hear Ed Miliband speak, you'd think he needs a trip to the doctor himself. For there was never a clearer case of amnesia. It was his party, the Labour Party, and his colleagues in Cabinet, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, who introduced the private sector into the NHS. They were even warned that once the door was open, they'd find the private healthcare providers hard to control. And so it has come to pass. And that's why we need principled opposition more than ever. You can't mobilize popular opposition if you yourself are not rightly to be trusted. And that's why so much of the responsibility of opposition to the current government has fallen to us, and we will rise to that challenge.